So let's get started. So why we're here. It became clear as the pandemic spread that there was a whole host of issues that people were going to have to deal with as life changed for us in a really real way. And one of the big things was travel, especially air travel. And what we started to hear from folks all across the country was, hey, I try to get my money back and the airline's not giving it back to me. And so we pivoted from our What the Fee campaign into this space in order to stand up for consumers and try to give them good information about how they could get their money back, but also advocate on their behalf. So we're going to put up a quick poll here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Anna to explain the poll and take it.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it. This poll is just a simple, how are your travel plans impacted by COVID-19? Did the airline cancel your flight? Did you cancel your own travel due to safety concerns? Or is it not applicable and you're just here because you're interested? We'd love to know that because these differences are important, as I'll get to in a minute. So my name is Anna Layton. As Tim said, I'm the Director of Financial Fairness and Legislative Strategy here at Consumer Reports. I spend a lot of my time focused on ensuring fairness in the marketplace. And my work brings me back to the airlines. A lot of people know they have complaints about fees, change fees, baggage fees, et cetera. And these keep cropping up. And as Tim mentioned, when COVID-19 first became evident, a lot of our lives turned upside down. And pretty much everyone stopped flying. Health concerns, canceled events, stay-at-home orders, and travel restrictions. Other countries just simply saying, do not come, made it impossible for people to travel. So I hope everybody's done with the poll. I'm gonna ask for the next slide, which goes into what's actually required here. The US Department of Transportation governs airline travel. And what they have said to airlines, both twice, once in April and once in May, is that they are obligated to provide a refund to passengers. This is both US and foreign airlines. If the carrier cancels the passenger scheduled flight or makes a significant change and the passenger chooses not to accept the alternative. So if the airline changes your flight by multiple hours, days, or changes how many stops, they are obligated to give you a refund. I will say they do not define significant schedule change, and that has been a problem for some folks, and we can talk about that if you all want to. And I saw a question in the chat right before we got started. They also said that if airlines gave people a voucher and those vouchers haven't been used, then the airlines are required to let people get a refund if they haven't used the voucher yet. On the next slide, we'll see where the limitations are. If you chose not to travel due to safety or health concerns, but the flight wasn't canceled or significantly changed, there is no legal obligation on the airlines. If you bought a non-refundable ticket, at this point, the US Department of Transportation is saying that they can offer you nothing, they can offer you a voucher if they choose to, but there is no obligation. If your flight went, and at some points in March and April, there were very, very few flights in the air. So if you were the unlucky person who was on that one flight that happened to go that day, then you are not owed a voucher by a refund by the airline, according to the US Department of Transportation. The next slide, the Department of Transportation has jurisdiction over travel agencies. So if you are owed a refund from the airline, you are owed a refund from the travel agent. And that's important. It's a little harder, as I think Bill will get into. We're seeing a lot of airlines and travel agencies refer people to the other. So it's harder to get a refund, but legally you are entitled to a refund if the airline made the changes or the cancellation. We have long argued since this began that this is absurd. While it may make sense in normal life to say if you bought a non-refundable ticket and you chose to change chose not to go, you're not owed a refund. this is a very, very different situation. Virtually nobody was traveling. People were barred from going to countries, going to other states. People were on stay-at-home orders. For the average consumer, there is no difference between a canceled flight and a flight where they had to decide not to go. So on the next slide, you'll see many of you may have seen or signed this petition to the airlines saying they should give a cash refund to any customer who had a flight canceled or elected to cancel a flight due to COVID-19.
Hey, Anna, just to interrupt real quick, Alan's going to report on the poll. We had over 1,000 people take the poll. Go ahead, Alan. So there you go. All right, Anna, back to you.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, this is what we've been thinking, that the airlines, sometimes the airlines canceled the flight, but a lot of people just made that decision not to travel. I know my family did. And we were lucky. Soon after we made that decision, the airline canceled our flight, so we were able to get a refund. I just saw in the chat that I'm speaking too softly. I will try to speak up. Apologies to those who are having trouble hearing me. Combining our petition with two other very similar petitions, 250,000 people signed this, telling the airlines to do better. We've also seen that thousands upon thousands of people submitted complaints to the US Department of Transportation. And on the next slide, you'll see what we're describing as a tidal wave of outrage. We asked folks to take a selfie of themselves, telling the airlines how much money they were owed. And it's significant. People across the country told us that they need that money for groceries, for rent. This is a really tough time. And they can't have the airlines holding onto their money. So what's next? Secretary Chao, the Secretary of Transportation, is definitely hearing these concerns. On the next slide, you'll see she ran a column in USA Today in late May saying that the airlines should treat consumers fairly and should give refunds if people were unable to travel, if they're facing financial hardship. We shot back just yesterday, also in the pages of USA Today, saying that Secretary Chao has the authority to require this. And she should do so. Alan, that's on the next slide. You'll be able to get this deck and look at both these columns. She can declare it to be unfair for airlines to not give refunds from COVID, and she can make them do it. To date, she is not. So given that, what we're finding is that people really have to fight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who's going to talk about the tips. There are ways people are finding to get their money back, even if both when they are legally entitled and the airline is being difficult, and when they're not legally entitled, but convince the airline that they are owed it. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill now.
Thanks, Anna. Hey, Bill, just before you get into tips, a question that we've been getting from a lot of people. How can you find out if the plane left or if it was canceled?
Certainly, sure. Okay, well, thanks very much, Anna. I'm Bill McGee. I'm the aviation advisor for Consumer Reports and the former editor of Consumer Reports Travel Letter. I've been with Consumer Reports for many, many years. And I just have to say, to provide some perspective, I've been involved in many, many, many advocacy campaigns over the years on airline safety and airline passenger rights and all kinds of issues. And I don't think anything I've ever been involved in 20 years with airlines has ever generated as much consumer response. We've sort of been blown away by it. So that's why we're pledging that we're going to stay with this and keep fighting for these refunds. Before we get into some of these tips, in answer to what Tim just said, a lot of people are confused because we've been speaking about the fact that there is a difference in whether or not the airline cancels your flight or you cancel your flight. That's something, if the flight hasn't operated yet, you need to go onto the airline's website or call the airline if you don't have internet access and confirm whether or not your flight has indeed been canceled. If you're doing it retroactively and you're trying to get a refund for a flight that, say, operated in April, you probably will not find that information online, but you can if you contact the airline. You can contact them, through various means. You can call them, et cetera. For those that are calling, get ready for very long wait times particularly during the daylight hours. My own personal thing is when I have to call an airline, it's never a pleasant thing, but I do it late at night. Some others who are morning people might want to do it early in the morning. So I think that sort of leads us into starting with our tips. And we can't stress this enough. Tip number one, you have to be persistent. The context here is that the airlines are simply doing everything in their power to hold on to your money. Now, the fact that all of us as taxpayers just gave the US airline industry a bailout of taxpayer money of more than $50 billion, that has not stopped the airlines from holding on to your money. And, Anna alluded to the fact that this is just, these are extraordinary circumstances. The deck is stacked against consumers with the airlines, even on the best of days. But in a situation like this, a national emergency, a worldwide pandemic, our feeling is that all flights operating since early March, since the lockdowns first started, have been affected by COVID one way or another, whether they've been canceled or not. And so to be persistent, we can't stress it enough. They are not going to make it easy for you, with very rare exceptions. Maybe if you're an elite frequent flyer member, you have a lot of miles, you have a very, a high-end ticket. But for most of us, you're going to have to jump through hoops. There's no getting around that. The good news is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on, we're starting to hear success stories, and we're very happy to hear that. We're starting to hear from people who said, we contacted Consumer Reports a few weeks ago. You gave us some advice, we did it, and yay, after 4 calls or 5 emails, we're suddenly going to be getting, a refund. So you need to know that going in. It's very unlikely this is going to be done in 1 call or 1 email. I, in fact, heard from a friend the other day, and she, in real time, was texting with an airline and in real time shared it with me. And she contacted this airline, a US airline, and said, I'd like a refund. And the person responding from the airline said, you'd like a voucher? And that happened 3 times. She said, no, I would like a refund. You would like a voucher? No, a refund. This is what you need to be ready for. They do not want to give up this money. So persistency is going to be key. So let's move on to the next slide. Many of you have gotten vouchers, but you would prefer a cash refund. And I think, again, some context is important here. Something like 87% of all passengers on the major airlines in the United States fly less than once a year. So this is an industry in which, very few people do most of the flying, do most of the buying of tickets, and most of us fly less than once a year. So the airlines are using that to their advantage. What we're hearing is that, Anna went over the rules before. Even in cases where the DOT specifically says you are entitled to a refund, the airlines, in some cases, to word this carefully, there seems to be like some sleight of hand. Consumers have contacted an airline. They were eligible for a refund. The airline said, well, would you like a voucher? And many consumers who didn't know what their rights were said, sure, I'll take a voucher. Not happily, but they thought, well, it's better than nothing. Well, now in many cases, they're going back and they're saying, and again, if you haven't used that voucher, if you have used the voucher, then that's a different story. But if you haven't used that voucher and you were eligible for a refund, you need to get back in touch with the airline immediately to have that voucher converted into a cash refund. Where, as we said earlier, you're going to need to be persistent. It's not going to be easy, but you do have that right.
Hey, Bill, just to interrupt for a second. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people are adding their own tips. We really encourage you, if you've had success or specific things have worked for you, please put that in the chat. We're going to send this whole recording and we're going to save the chat and we'll go through that later. So if you have tips that have worked for you, please put those in the chat. Okay, back to you, Bill.
Great. Okay, I think we're ready for moving on. So it's one thing if you're trying to do this retroactively. What do you do if you have a booking? And let's say it's as soon as, later this month, and you're uncertain. So if you have a pending flight, if the flight has been canceled, you'll want to confirm, first of all, if your flight has been canceled. Today's Thursday. Let's say you're supposed to fly somewhere next Wednesday. You want to know now whether or not that flight's been canceled. If it's been canceled, then fine. You can start the process to go about getting your refund, and as we said, be persistent. But what happens if it hasn't been canceled? There's a perception out there because of all the news reports of aircraft that have been parked in the desert and airline employees who've been furloughed that, that there aren't flights operating. There are plenty of flights operating, thousands of flights every day here in the United States domestically. So the question is, what happens if your flight is still operating? This gets really, really tricky. And we wish it wasn't this way. We have contacted the DOT. Consumer Reports has called the DOT. We've spoken to the people that oversee these policies directly numerous times, in fact, since March, 3 times. And we have said to them, can you do something about this? Because consumers are doing this dance where you're trying to see who's going to cancel first. And if you wait too long, it could hurt you. If you do it too soon, it could hurt you. So what we are recommending is that you wait until 14 days. Circle that day on your calendar 2 weeks before. The airlines have these buckets of 7 days, 14 days, 21 days when they're scheduling flights and pricing flights. And so we feel it's a good compromise to go to 14 days out. If you're flying 14 days from now, start contacting the airline. Okay. Now, Anna gave the overview here. Again, we think it's just absurd that where I live in Connecticut, the mayor of my town, the governor of my state, and the president of the United States have all told me that I shouldn't be leaving my house in recent weeks and months. And, as well as just about every health authority in the country and in the world. And so the fact that the burden is on a consumer, and the fact that even though there is a lockdown and there is a health hazard, that an airline would penalize you by saying, well, we operated the flight and you had a non-refundable fare. We think that's absurd. But today's focus is really on trying to help you in the most practical way possible. But we want you to know that we're continuing to fight this fight with the Department of Transportation, with Congress, through the media, through every means that we have. And we've been bowled over by how many people have responded to this. We really didn't, early on, we didn't know how many people was affected. We put something up on our website at Consumer Reports and said, let us know. And we've gotten almost 3,600 stories and complaints. And now we see there's more than 1,000 people here today. And I believe over 100,000 people have signed the petition. So getting back to this issue, if your flight hasn't operated, don't be passive. You're going to have to put a little work into this. Wait till that 14-day window comes. If your flight's been canceled, start the process for a refund. If your flight hasn't been canceled, on 14 days prior, start the process of letting the airline know that you do not feel safe and comfortable flying, or you may not even be allowed to fly, either by medical decree or because you're still on lockdown, depending on where you live.
Hey, Bill, Alan's going to put up another poll. This one is going to ask people if they tried for a cash refund. So while Bill's talking, go ahead and answer the poll, and then I'll interrupt Bill again in a little bit to give the results of the poll. Go ahead, Bill.
Great. Okay, we can go on to 4. So remember I was saying that most consumers fly less than once a year. So for most consumers, interacting with an airline is a very rare experience. But for those that do, that can be a very troubling experience too. So this may sound basic. It may sound like something that, you might say, duh, of course. But the bottom line is you really need to be ready when you talk to an airline, particularly, as you say, since, if you're doing it by phone, you might be waiting for a very long time. And suddenly, after a couple of hours, someone gets on the line. Have everything in front of you. Have all of your documentation. And every interaction that you have with someone from that airline, whether it's in person, whether it's on the phone, whether it's from text or email, have records of it. Get names, dates, times for all of your flights. Make sure you know the airlines, if it's multiple airlines, which it may be in many cases on your itinerary, make sure you have the flight numbers, the routing. I heard from someone who said, well, I called and they said, well, where are you flying? And I said, Chicago to Los Angeles. And they didn't know the dates, they didn't know the flights, and they had to call back, and you don't want to go through that process. So be ready. And we can tell you over time, long before this COVID issue, that the more documentation you provide to airlines, the more seriously they're going to take your complaints. We've seen that time and again over the years. Okay, next.
Hey, Bill, I think Alan's going to put up the results for the poll, but it sounds like 55% were unsuccessful getting a cash refund, 5 were successful, and about 41% haven't tried yet, but that's why they're here on the call,
Right.
which really corresponds with what we're hearing from folks. There's been a small uptick on people getting refunds, but it's definitely not the vast majority, which is why we're still promoting.
Right. Yeah, we've got a long way to go. As I say, I've seen some of the success stories, and it's great to read them. But 4% isn't nearly what we want to see. So there's some other things you need to do during this process too. We've been talking a lot about the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the fact is, I mean, obviously all government agencies, play an important part in consumers' lives, but the U.S. Department of Transportation has a particularly important role because since 1978, there's something called federal preemption, which basically, when the airline industry was deregulated, it means that all consumer interactions are done on the federal level. So you don't have the rights as an airline passenger that you have even with other sectors of the travel industry, for example, with hotels and car rentals and other travel products, resorts. In other words, you cannot reach out to a state attorney general. States cannot regulate the airline industry individually and provide consumer protections and consumer rights. And you don't even have the right to, in overwhelmingly most cases, file lawsuits against airlines except on the federal level. So therefore, this is the reason that yesterday, as Anna mentioned, she and I wrote an op-ed for USA Today calling directly on DOT Secretary Elaine Chao to use the power of her office to protect passengers, because it's even more important in the airline sector than it is in virtually every other industry in the country. So it's critical that when you're going through this process and you're filing these complaints with airlines, to CC the United States Department of Transportation on all flights to the United States, within the United States, and from the United States. And we have had multiple conversations with the DOT in recent years about all kinds of issues, safety issues, consumer rights issues, financial issues. And they have stated to us quite clearly that they act, and frankly, we would like to see them act more, but they act on issues based on the number of complaints, okay? Even if it's a critical safety issue that could even very well be a life and death issue, if the needle doesn't move enough, if there aren't enough complaints about a given issue, they may not put much effort into addressing that. They have stated that to us. So it is critical to inundate the US Department of Transportation with complaints. And you may or may not have seen news reports in recent weeks. Every month, the DOT puts out a what they call a consumer report, in fact, and it tracks airline performance and lost baggage and on-time flights and things. And the complaints specifically related to refunds are off the charts as when you compare it to the same month last year. The most recent numbers are for March. We'll be getting April soon, and they have skyrocketed. It's something like 13%, 13 times more than it was last year. So CC the DOT, and then as advocates, we have been fighting for many years at Consumer Reports for what we have termed and others have termed a passenger bill of rights. We don't have one in the United States. Basically, you're at the behest of the airlines, and all of your rights are dictated by the airlines and very few by the DOT. But the good news is in other areas of the world, there are regulations that protect you. And one of the most robust passenger rights provisions is in the European Union, in the EU. So this is critical. If you are seeking a refund for a flight that either operated to Europe, from Europe, or within Europe, then you also should file a complaint with the EU. Okay, so to be clear, if you flew from Paris to London and had a problem, that's not a DOT issue. But if you flew from New York to Paris or Los Angeles, to Tokyo, then that is, that's an issue for other countries to look at. So with the European rules, if you flew to or from or within Europe, you should CC the EU, because unlike the DOT, that's more or less record keeping and rarely gets involved in these issues directly, they will go to bat for you If you say that an airline, including a US airline, be very clear, let's say you flew from Washington to Paris, and you were on a US airline and you're seeking a refund, the EU will assist you in seeking that refund. And
Hey, Bill.
so we're putting up
we're
information on how to contact them.
Hey, Bill, we're getting a couple questions about outside the US and the EU. What about Canada, South America, and other places that aren't covered by the EU or DOT? Thanks.
Right, right. EU is by far, as I said, the most robust protections. But the good news is for Canada, this was one of the rare times Consumer Reports weighed in on a government issue outside the United States. We supported about a year and a half ago a Bill of Rights that just was put in place in Canada. So Europe and Canada are the places where you have more robust protections than in the United States. The rest of the world, it's country by country, and it can be a bit of a toss-up. I wish we had better news there, but it's Europe and Canada where you would want to CC the government agencies there, and we can provide those links to you.
And somebody's asking specifically about China as well, because they're kind of outside of all this.
About China, is that what you said, Tim?
Yeah, China. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Again, if the flight, originated or the destination was in the U.S., then you have U.S. DOT protections. But with China, you would have to deal with the Chinese government. And again, it's Europe and Canada right now, European Union to be specific, and Canada where you have the protections.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay. And I should add, if it's not going to be added later, let me add it now while I'm thinking of it. We always want you to CC Consumer Reports on all this. As we've noted, we have a ton of stories and complaints, and we plan to use them. We want to go back to the Department of Transportation. We're going to be very loud and noisy about this, and we suggest that you be loud and noisy as well. So I think we're ready to move on. So we've also heard some success through something called the Fair Credit Billing Act. This is a regulation that's been in place for several years now, and it protects you on all credit card purchases. Overwhelmingly, most people book airline tickets through a credit card. But if for any reason you're not, particularly if you're buying a ticket at an airport or through a brick and mortar travel agency and you're thinking of using a check, we would advise you to use a credit card if you can. Because the Fair Credit Billing Act basically puts the burden on the company that basically you would get the refund through the credit card company or the bank that issued the credit card, and then they go on the back end to fight, the airline or the corporation to get the money back. So there are some caveats, and you need to look at the fine print there. Again, we're providing the link for that. The Fair Credit Billing Act, I think, is something that a lot of people are not aware of. I hear it all the time when I mention it to people. And I know, before I even have had a chance to scroll through all the questions that are popping up, I know that there are going to be questions from folks saying, well, we're talking about airlines. What about other sectors of the travel industry? Clearly, today's focus is on airlines and on the Department of Transportation. But if you have a problem with a refund from a car rental company, from a hotel, from a resort, from some sort of vacation package, et cetera, cruise, it's less likely in certain sectors because many of those sectors, most of the bookings are paid for, on the day of the day that you're going to be using the product. But if for any reason you have a problem with one of those sectors, Fair Credit Billing Act is absolutely critical.
Hey, Bill, another good question. People are wondering in the Q&A, should consumers think about purchasing tickets for the future, 6 months to a year from now? Do we have any good advice about how to navigate the future? So if you can your wizard hat and stare into a crystal ball and tell us your thoughts.
So I thought you promised me no tough questions today, Tim. What's going on here? You're right. I mean, I do have to take out a crystal ball. I get this all the time from family and friends who are saying, well, it's the summertime and the kids are out of school and we're thinking of going somewhere in August. These are really, really tough questions to answer, and they have to be taken on a case-by-case basis. First of all, there's the health issues. Does anyone have a real handle on whether or not we're through the first wave, and we're ready to be, come off of lockdown. There's so many questions related to this that are beyond the scope of, the airlines. The bottom line is, the caution that I would give is, if you're looking to buy a ticket now for future travel, take a look at what's happened in the last couple of months and how the airline industry has responded, and how the U.S. Department of Transportation has failed to, in our view, properly protect consumers, and use that when you're weighing this decision to travel as well. Not trying to scare people from traveling, and we're all anxious to get back out there, and the weather is nice, and I get that. And I'm anxious to travel too, because even though I spend a lot of time criticizing the airlines, I love to fly. And, I haven't flown since I flew to Washington to testify in Congress on these issues, on airline issues, that is, not COVID issues. So it is a tough question, but I think you need to weigh, particularly if you're going to buy a non-refundable ticket, that is a really dangerous thing to do right now. Now, what's the flip side there? The flip side is non-refundable tickets are always cheaper, nearly in every case. So it's hard for us as advocates to give advice that, that is going to serve you well in the next couple of months. But we would advise you to be cautious, and we would advise you to talk to the airline about this if you have questions, or the travel agent if you're booking through a third party, and say, well, what happens if I'm buying this ticket for August and now there's a second lockdown and I can't travel? What are my rights? What are my protections?
Great. Thanks, Bill.
And before someone asks, I'm sure someone's going to ask about travel insurance too. So a word about that. I would be shocked if somebody hasn't already, with all these messages that are flipping by here, if someone hasn't asked about travel insurance. The fact is, with travel insurance, again, please be cautious, because with travel insurance, there are caveats and exclusions based on quote unquote known situations. So for example, if you buy a ticket during hurricane season and there hasn't been a hurricane declared, you may be eligible for travel insurance to kick in. If you buy it after that hurricane has been named by, the National Weather Service, then it's a different situation, and they will say it's a known situation, and you may not be entitled to travel insurance coverage. So you have to ask a lot of questions. We're sorry to put so much burden on consumers, and that's why, at the same time, we're fighting in Washington for better protections. For years, Consumer Reports has been saying, why can't we have uniform passenger rights as they do in the European Union, where the burden is not on the consumer to fight with airlines, but the burden is on the airlines to make sure that consumers are satisfied. So with that, I think we can go to the next one. This is great. There it is. United Airlines owes me $485.35. Shame works, and we know it works because we monitor this all day long. And we have a great team here at Consumer Reports who puts all of these messages up on Twitter and on Facebook, and we're seeing it every day. And I see it all the time. And I'm on social media, and I go to the airline's own pages. So the first thing you should do, if you're fighting for a refund and you're on social media, go to that airline's Twitter page. They all have them, or their Facebook page, or both. And we have seen this where someone will go on, and particularly on Twitter, and they'll say, hey, Airline X owes me, $400. And I've been getting the runaround for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And, what's going on here? And we all know how quickly things can go viral on social media. And then what happens very often is even strangers, and not friends of this person, will then say, yeah, that airline also owes me $800. And then all of a sudden they're piling on. And the next thing you know, it's gone viral. And the next thing you know, you'll see a representative from the airline suddenly jump on and say, well, we're very distressed to hear this. How can we help you? Which is great, but it would have been even better if they had done it 4 weeks earlier when the complaint first started. So shame works. There's no two ways about it. There are other methods as well. You can write, I'm sorry, Tim.
Oh, just a heads up that CR has also been retweeting people calling out the airlines. So if you tag us in a tweet, we'll work to amplify your message, which is actually a lot better than trying to email us sometimes. So feel free to tag us. Our handle is at Consumer Reports Advocacy.
Right. No, that's a great point, Tim. You're absolutely right. And there are other methods as well, particularly for those that aren't on social media for whatever reason, you should contact your local media, letter to the editor of a local newspaper, your local news channels. I've noticed, in fact, I've been asked to appear on local news, TV news and radio news channels all around the country where they're looking at this specifically. To state the obvious, the airline industry is all about the geography. And so if you happen to be in a city where an airline is headquartered, or even more important, where they have a hub, and, particularly the big ones, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, et cetera, they don't want to see this in the local media. They don't want to see complaints against, those airlines. So again, shame works. It's something you should consider.
Great, thanks, Bill. And yeah, we've seen some really great results of people being able to call, like, combining shame with being persistent is probably your best call right now. Bill, we had a couple of additional questions, or Anna, whoever feels best answering that. First is, what about travel points and rewards? Can people get refunded for that? How does that work? And hey, Cindy, that's awesome. That is your niece. Anyway, how can people get refunds on the rewards? Is that possible? How does that all work?
Yeah, that's a much more complex thing. If you purchased your ticket through the reward system, the rules are very different because you're technically not purchasing a ticket. It's, many airlines, in fact, use the term award, A-W-A-R-D, not reward. And so the rules are different because you're agreeing to an entire set of rules. The reason that Anna and I have been so vocal today about speaking about the Department of Transportation and the need for a passenger bill of rights is what I think many people don't understand is that when you buy an airline ticket, when you book and you swipe your credit card, whether you realize it or not, you're agreeing to something called the airline's contract of carriage. And these documents can be, if you print them out, they can run 90 pages or more printed. And you're agreeing to all of that fine print. Attorneys call them contracts of adhesion because they're written for one side and not the other. You can't negotiate. You can't say, well, I don't agree to that clause. Then you don't fly. And so one of the things that we have been saying in recent weeks and months is the airlines have a whole bunch of exclusions in their contracts, so what they call acts of God and force majeure. That is, and this clearly, this pandemic, which is the worst we've seen in a century, is a force majeure. Well, they're protected. We're saying the same protections should extend to consumers. If the President of the United States is telling you not to travel, then why are you being penalized for an airline for not showing up at the airport? Specifically with the issue of awards, you're talking about even further exclusions and rules that can kick in. So most of the airlines have a dedicated desk that just handles award claims and issues. And I would recommend you don't go through the normal channels if what you're dealing with here is about points or mileage. Deal directly with the desk that handles that, because they're going to be much more adept. There are people that are trained just to deal with those questions.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. And I'm just going to ask them both at the same time. Bill and Anna, you guys can answer them however you want. First question is, are there any special protections for seniors who are trying to get relief? And the second question is, are any airlines better at giving cash refunds than the others?
I'll take the senior one and give Bill the other. Unfortunately, no. If you bought a non-refundable ticket, the airlines have the same obligations regardless of who you are, what your health conditions are, except to the extent that if you're persistent, shame, using all the techniques that Bill suggested. But unfortunately, I've seen a lot of comments on here about the event I was going to was canceled. Shouldn't I deserve a refund? Or I'm particularly susceptible to COVID. The rules do not account for that. And that's what Secretary Chao's op-ed in USA Today that we linked to here, where she said, there are people who this is a real problem and they should get a fair refund. We agree with her. We just think that she should make the airlines do it.
Right. As to which airlines are better than others or worse than others, to be very clear, in the complaints that we've received complaints about every single scheduled airline in the United States and a ton of airlines, foreign airlines that operate into the United States, all of the big names in Europe and Asia, et cetera, as well as I said, every single domestic airline. We're still sort of crunching those numbers to see, who's been particularly problematic. But over time, we have seen a lot of complaints about United. And that was confirmed to us when we saw the DOT's statistics, which also indicated that. If you're not aware of this resource, which many people are not, you should check it out at dot.gov. Right on the homepage, you'll see a link to the Air Travel Consumer Report, no relation to us at Consumer Reports. And these monthly reports, I mean, okay, I'm an airline geek, so I read them every month and spend the weekend looking at them, but they're of great interest, I think, to consumers, because they tell you, you'll see disproportionately which airlines generate the most complaints, and specifically on what issues they generate complaints. So we're still dealing with that, but we want to make clear some airlines have been better than others, and we're always happy to give credit where it's due. But there really has not been a single airline in the United States that has stepped up and said, well, we're going to just eliminate this problem. Some have sort of talked about it, and some have, reached out to us and made some efforts, and we give them credit for that. But, for people to have to jump through all these hoops, particularly, as Anna mentioned, people that are concerned about their health or their age and they don't want to fly, we just think it's unconscionable.
Great. I think that's a good note to end on, or a bad note to end on, however it might be. And just a reminder, we're going to be sending this deck along with all the links and the resources after the call. But what Bill was talking about is absolutely right, that not much has been done about this, but because of the hard work of Bill and Anna, we have been able to get a bill introduced into Congress. So if you have a moment today, if you call the number there, 202-751-4118, and enter your zip code, you'll be connected to your House member, and we're asking you to either talk to whoever answers the phone or leave a message calling on them to pass HR 6965 and the companion bill in the Senate 3727. This bill would legislate that airlines have to give cash refunds for all flights canceled during the virus. And so, we're also putting pressure on the DOT. We're also putting pressure on the airlines. But this is something that Congress can do. They can actually legislate this. And we think it's just a common sense thing. So we'll include this number in our follow-up email as well. But if you got a pen handy, just write that number down. It's really simple to do. You just call in, you enter your zip code, and you're connected automatically to your representative in the House.
Tim, could I just add one thing?
Please do.
We haven't talked about bookings that are made through third parties, and I think that's critical. I'm sure many of the people that are sending in questions are saying, well, I didn't book directly with American or Delta or United. I booked through an online travel agency like Expedia or Priceline, or I booked through a traditional brick and mortar storefront travel agency. Anna went through that at the beginning. She said, she made it clear that there are certain protections from the DOT, but we are hearing, as she alluded, we're hearing about sort of runaround where a consumer will say, I contacted airline A and they told me to contact, travel site B, and now I'm in the middle. So you need to keep pursuing that and CC the DOT, because they do have some oversight over third-party ticket sellers. The other point just wanted to reinforce is we've been talking a lot about trying to get refunds for flights where you're not eligible. If you are eligible and the airline has not given you a refund, that is something that the DOT has the power to enforce and the power to punish through fines. So we want to hear those stories, because we want to go to the DOT if folks haven't gone to them directly and say, look, this person was due a refund from this airline and they didn't get it. And that's something that the DOT can hit an airline with a fine in those cases. So we need to hear those stories as well. We're really talking to two groups of people today, those who are eligible for refunds in the DOT guidelines and those that aren't. We're trying to help all of you.
Great. And we can flip to the next slide, Alan. And yeah, that's the best place to find us. There's links in the chats to our Share Your Story. That's the best way to be in touch with us. If you do reach out to the DOT or to the airlines, if you do tag the airline on Twitter, please tag us at CR Advocacy, and the hashtag is refund passengers. There's also been a lot of really good tips shared in here today from consumers, which we love to see. You can share those tips on our Facebook page, and we'd love to see them there. Anna, Bill, thank you both so much. Folks who have joined us today, thank you again so much. We host these webinars pretty regularly, so you can go to our homepage and sign up for other webinars that are going to be coming. Thank you to everyone who helped behind the scenes, and thank you everyone for joining. Alan, I think with that, we're all done.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everyone for being on. I'm going to leave everything live for another 60 seconds to make sure we capture all the chat things, and then we'll kick you off. But really appreciate everyone being here, and thanks for playing, and good luck out there.
Bye, everyone.